Hey, how's it going? I'm Lewis from GroovyDSP, and the topic for this video today is comparing different synths. And a lot of times when we think of synthesizers, a lot of people think of a synthesizer. You have a oscillator or a filter, and the idea I want to present here is that the actual oscillators differ greatly, and so do the filters. Some filters are creamier than others. Some sound like a dentist drill when you really crank up the resonance. Some oscillators have some subtle tuning drifting that kind of adds some interest to the sound, and some are locked solid. Some have a lot of high ends, some have a lot of bottom end. It just depends, and we're going to go over a few examples of this using a few analog synths, a virtual analog, and a very digital synthesizer.
Okay, so the first victim here is the JU06 by Roland, which is a modern virtual analog that attempts to reproduce the sounds of the Juno 106, a classic analog synth line. Next up, we've got the Korg Minilog, which is a modern analog synthesizer. This thing is mostly analog, including the oscillators and filters, so it's a good kind of thing to compare against. Then we've got the Arturia Mini Brute, which is one of the first really affordable monophonic synthesizers from the 00s that I remember. Because, for a while, remember, people weren't really making analog synths except for really high-end stuff. Stuff like Virus TI, that was a virtual analog or, analog modeling synth where it considers the beat's knees, and something like this was, analog was considered passé for a little bit, and it kind of has come back in a big way. And for the absolutely digital sounding synth I want to compare against, I've chosen the RS4000 because I had it handy. Full disclosure is I work at the company that produced this. I did not work on this particular synthesizer, but nevertheless I thought I should make that known before we proceed here. Now, there are a few things to listen for as I play these oscillators. For one, I'm just going to use a sawtooth at the low couple octaves to give you an idea, and I'll play a single note, then I'll play a fifth or a octave, so you can kind of get a sense of whether or not you hear any beating, kind of a flangey kind of sound as I play these chords, and whether or not there's a lot of top end or a lot of bottom end, and just kind of tune in on that, and it'll be more obvious when we compare to other synthesizers. And one thing to keep in mind about the Juno as we go over it is that I said it's an analog synthesizer, and this is a virtual analog recreation of it, but the original Juno, keep in mind, had digital, digitally driven oscillators, so they didn't really drift the way older oscillators did. In fact, drift was considered a flaw at some point, and now we kind of like it. So, here we go. Let's see how this thing sounds. Here we go with our polyphonic analog synth, and you'll notice when I play octaves, you'll hear some interesting things. Lastly, we've got the Mini Brute, which is unfortunately monophonic, so you're not going to hear any beating or flanging or, anything quite like that. But you can listen to the character of the saw wave. Okay, so this is where the rubber really hits the road here and causes synthesizers to sound way different from each other. And keep in mind, we're only comparing subtractive synthesizers, other synths that have different ways of producing audio. We're not really covering those here. We're doing subtractive synths because everyone is familiar with them. So let's go ahead and hear what the filters sound like.
Now, I also want you to think about parameter spaces. What I mean by that is a lot of people, their first instinct when they learn how to do synthesizers, digital synthesizers, is they say, I want to make a modular. And they take a bunch of textbook formulas like, the RBJ filters, and, they take the blit, oscillator type, and they just kind of copy the code, put it in. And it's a fun computer science experiment, but it's not necessarily the greatest synthesizer. You want your synth to have some kind of character. You want to think about what kind of patches you want to be able to make with it. And so you have to be proficient yourself in making a variety of patches before you begin on this journey. It's almost like a macro patch design, building a synthesizer is. And you're determining by what your ranges are, what parameters you put in, how they're arranged or whatever. You're steering the users in different directions, you're enabling them to make different series of patches, you're determining what they can and cannot make, and while users will surprise you with what they do with your synthesizer, it's something to really think about. You don't just dump, a bunch of knobs and stuff in and, expose all the parameters and call it a day, right? At some level, if you're making a modular, you might as well just give them a C++ compiler and say, here. Maybe that's a bit extreme, but you got the point, right? So let's go and explore some of these synths.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is the oscillator section of a Juno, the JU06 that we were using before. And it has two buttons to toggle on two different waveforms at the same time. You can have a pulse or square, and you also have a saw wave. And I say two waveforms, not two oscillators, because this is all one oscillator, yes, including the sub-oscillator that you can put on. I believe it works like there's one oscillator driving it for each voice, and it goes off and gets split into different wave shapers, something like that. I'm not super hip to analog synth design, more of a digital guy, but yeah, so all these wave shapes stay perfectly in sync, and as we saw before, that can be a bit boring. Luckily, aside from the PWM, which does liven it up a little bit, they added a chorus. And the chorus on this thing is kind of magic. It's imitating an analog chorus, which has a lot of kind of low end. It's very warm. I guess not really low end, I guess kind of low mids. And one interesting decision is it's basically on or off. You have two buttons, you can hit one, you can hit two, or you can hit both of them, and they all have different kind of speeds and depths. So instead of having knobs, they opted for buttons. I think because it's easy to use, it's quick to make patches with, and that's kind of a design of the Juno. That's kind of a theme of it, is that you can dial in patches quick because there's not that many parameters, and it also doesn't give the user too much rope to hang themselves with either. So it's a kind of an entry-level synth, I think, is the idea. You might notice too that there's only one envelope, which, you know, it's assignable to the amplitude or not. It always controls the filter, I believe. So, you know, when it's not engaged on the amplitude envelope, or rather to control the amplitude, you hit the key, it's full blast, you release the key, and it's gone. And that's great for basses, so you can have it goes bounce, you know, and then at the end of that, you can release, and you don't have that fade out, you know, it's not tracking the filter. However, for a pad that you want to fade in and out with the filter, you can flip that switch and suddenly it's fading in and out. Now the Mini Brute is similar in that each voice, well, one voice, it's mono, is just one oscillator, and you can have a sub, and it also has this handy waveform mixer, which is a lot like the SH101 synthesizer from days gone by. And if you remember when I was talking about the Juno, I said that a single oscillator has a tendency to sound a bit thin because you can't really detune it. And if it's mono, you really can't detune it. So they had a different solution from just throwing chorus on it. So what they did is that in addition to having PWM for the, you know, pulse width modulation for the square, which a lot of stuff has, they also let you do some weird phasing stuff with the saw, and they call it ultra saw, but it really is kind of a phasing trick that kind of makes it sound very animated, kind of like PWM but for a saw. They also have a metalizer, which kind of starts folding the triangle wave into interesting shapes, and that gives you kind of a metallic, almost digital kind of sound. And each of these can track the envelope, so what you get is a different way of animating, or, you know, creating motion with the sound that would otherwise be very static sounding. So here you have the same design problem in both synths and two different solutions to that problem. And they're both good solutions, and they both sound radically different from each other. And not only that, but the aims and the themes of the synthesizer are very different as well. So, you know, the Juno is great for pads, it sounds very grounded. The Mini Brute, although it's analog, has a very hard, aggressive sound, and that was kind of seems like the design philosophy here. You know, they have the name Brute is everywhere. It has this thing called the Brute Factor, this knob you're looking at here, and you can crank that up and it causes this feedback loop that causes really unpredictable things to happen. So between that and the metalizer, you have a lot of really sharp, crazy sounds coming out of this thing. So, you know, there is definitely a philosophy to this design, and I think every good synthesizer has a philosophy, you know, and it's not just the parameters that they put on this that kind of give it that brute philosophy. It's, you know, you heard it before in the oscillators and the filters, and how everything's tuned. I mean, it's coherent. It's a coherent design with a definite aim. And that's kind of what you want when you make a synthesizer. And here we've got the mini log that we used. And, you know, first, I'm not trying to, you know, review synths here. I'm just kind of pointing out these design differences and different approaches. Because, you know, that's what we really care about on this channel is, you know, when we go to make our own synth, you know, what kind of decisions do we want to make? Because everything's a series of trade-offs. So, you know, for these, you might notice a big cutoff knob that it's begging to be turned and tweaked. And you know why you might ask cutoff? Well, if you're making techno or EDM, you're going to be turning the cutoff knob a lot. You're not going to want to do that necessarily as much with EG int, though that does happen, you know, for your 303 style lines. You know, definitely not going to be wanting to really tweak the resonance, not that much. So, you know, they know their target audience here. You know, they know what style of music they want people to make with it. And that's just an important consideration. And, you know, what's interesting about these synths, a lot of Korg synths, is that they do have like a big knob, like a big fun knob. So although this synth is a bit, you know, I think it leans a little bit towards vanilla. I like it a lot. It sounds really good, but it does lean a bit vanilla. but it also has a certain kind of chord character that I would describe as creamy. And you know, this has it. Their Poly 800 that I used to have has it. You know, it's kind of interesting how you get these different synths from different companies, and it's like a certain sound that they aim for. But going back to the big knob here, you know, that's not the only piece of gear that has this. You know, their Volcas often have a big knob, or the Micro Korg popular entry-level synth has like that big knob you turn to change the presets or parameters or something. So that's kind of a constant in their design. But yeah, the Mini-Log is generally focused on just being a cheap analog polyphonic synth, which in itself is kind of a hard thing to achieve. Which brings us to your synth. You know, what kind of synth do you want to create? You know, what kind of music genres do you foresee it being used for? Who's your target audience? What kind of parameter space are you going to give the user? You know, so many things to think about. And I hope that you came away from this inspired and wanting to try some new, crazy, weird things. Because, you know, there's so many synthesizers out there, there's so many VSTs and whatnot, and if you're going to make something cool, you might as well make something a little bit different, or something at least that's focused. So thanks for watching, and I hope you were able to get something out of this video, and it wasn't just me babbling for 20 minutes. And I guess I'll see you next time. Thanks.